All right, so Amber just asked me a question about being able to figure out what your grade is right now because you don't see a percentage on Angel to see where you stand. And I do that purposely because often it's not right. And students will rely upon that and then find out at the end of the semester that their grade is not as good as they thought it was. There is this page in your Angel Shell under lessons and course policies and procedures. It talks about how to calculate your own grade. So if you don't know how to do this, this is the explanation of how to calculate what your percentage is at a given point in time. Okay, so if you are interested in trying to figure it out, look it up, look this up, try to do it. If you have questions, go ahead and email me and I'll see if I can verify whether or not you did it correctly. I copied this, got myself in trouble for this too. I copied this from somebody's Angel Shell because they were asking the question, but then I stripped it of any names or anything, so it could be any student. And the student got furious with me. Like because I use it, as a description, like as if every person in the world was going to know that it was John Smith that I am using. Anyway, so there's an example of how to go about doing it. What?
I'd be mad at those scores too.
Yeah, that's why they were mad, is not because anybody was going to know it was them, but because of the fact that they were doing so poorly. But anyway, so that's there. Check it out, and if you have any questions, like I said, it's under course, you go lessons, course policies and procedures, and then calculating grades, and then that document will come up. All right. So, I did this, did I tell you this? This is my one and only PowerPoint I've ever done in my life. And I did it when I was applying for the full-time job here. So they probably thought, I did this kind of stuff all the time. Never done another one before. Or since me. And actually my daughter did most of it because I didn't know how to do PowerPoint. I guess that's unethical, huh? Because I let her do it for me. Anyway, so when we talk about population in the or slavery in the South, what they're doing at this particular point is they're kind of stopping again in the chronological flow in the textbook, and they're talking about, okay, snapshot of slavery. This is where slavery stands in the middle of the 1800s. So let's talk a little bit about some of the numbers, such as just population in general. Now, if you look at the notes, this is all laid out in the notes because this PowerPoint kind of tries to follow the notes, but what was the population of the South in 1860? Just the South, the southern states.
12 million.
12 million people total. Now, how many of those were white and how many of those were slaves?
8 million white, 4 million.
I think about 4 million was slave black.
Yep. So 8 million are white
White,
and 4 million are slave.
1/3.
So 1/3 of their population are slaves. And if you were white, that was a concern for you because obviously you have them outnumbered, but still there's an awful lot of them compared to how many there are of you, and they're concerned about uprisings, revolts, and things like that. So it definitely causes some issues. So 8 million white, about 4 million slaves. Obviously those are rounded numbers. There's also some free blacks that live in the South. Blacks that over the years have somehow gained their freedom. Sometimes they've been able to purchase their own freedom. Probably most of the time they were given their freedom when their master died. In their will they would say, I free my slaves. So how many of those are there?
350,000.
250,000. So not many compared to the rest. And so there's 250,000 free blacks. This is in the South. How many free blacks are in the North? Would you think it's more or less than that?
Less.
This is really strong.
I'm going to think more because they didn't have slavery up here, and that's where people went to escape. And even if you were freed in the South, you would want to get out of the South and go to the North. So,
Seems like it would make sense, right, to be more, plus the population of the North is higher too, right?
yeah.
Okay, but you're wrong.
Oh,
It's probably a lot more expensive to live in the north, wouldn't it?
Actually, it's almost exactly the same. Again, these are rounded numbers. I don't know if it's a little more, a little less, but there's about the same amount in both the North and the South, which is kind of interesting. Just, there's not that many free blacks at all living in the United States at this point in time. All right, so look at that little bar chart. Pretty cool, huh?
But you didn't do it, so I'm not.
Right, yeah, true. My daughter did it. She was very sweet. You know, she really wanted me to get a full-time job, so I had made more money so I could help her do whatever she wanted to do, which was to go to college herself. So, all right, so let's talk about cotton production. One of the reasons why slavery continued to expand in the South was because cotton became so important. Cotton was actually kind of dying out because of the type of cotton. The long staple cotton that was being grown at the time was not as easy to grow, not as marketable. Just, it wasn't a big crop for us. And slavery was kind of starting to decline because we still needed slaves for tobacco and rice, but there wasn't like a really huge crop that you needed lots and lots of slaves for. But when we started to shift to short staple cotton, there was such a huge market for it that more and more people wanted to start growing cotton, but in order to grow it, you need laborers, and they wanted slaves. So it starts to switch about 1830. That's when we start to see the shift from where it looked like there might be a decline in slavery to all of a sudden slavery is kind of reinvigorated and more people want slaves. So 1830 to 1860, the number of slaves are growing, and the desire to hold on to their slaves was becoming more intense. But a lot of it has to do with short staple cotton. Now, one of the reasons for that is as I said, the short staple cotton was much more in demand. It was actually something that the textile factories in Europe really wanted short staple cotton to make the different products that they made. There's also, I don't even remember what my PowerPoints say, so I'm not sure of this. Okay, so we began, by 1860, we were supplying 75% of all of what Great Britain needed for cotton. And they were the huge manufacturing capital of the world at this time, especially in textiles. So it was like, as much as we could produce, they would buy it.
That's 50% of the world.
And Great Britain may be the textile capital of the world, but there's other places that are producing textiles as well, and we were supplying 50% of all of the world's cotton. So people in the South that were growing cotton really started to get pretty puffed up, like they can't live without us. If they don't have our cotton, they can't continue to make money. So it was like, we can't lose. No matter what we do, we're going to be able to make money as long as we can produce cotton. So the other piece of that, what did they need to be able to process the cotton?
Yeah, machine.
Hmm?
Is it a machine?
Some kind of machine?
Again.
It's called the cotton gin, right? So the cotton gin that had been invented back in 1793, as we start shifting to short staple cotton, you need the cotton gin to clean the seeds out of the cotton. And before the cotton gin, it would take a slave all day just to clean 1 pound of cotton. With the cotton gin, that same slave, by putting it through the machine, can produce or can process 50 pounds of cotton. I mean, that's a huge impact in terms of being able to process this stuff quickly and get it to the market. So that's another huge part of why the short staple cotton, at first people were like, well, we can't do that because it's so labor intensive to clean it, but now that we have the cotton gin, the cotton itself is more in demand, and now we have the ability to process it quickly. So more and more people wanted to have slaves. Now, I don't know about you guys, but when I was growing up and learned about slavery and everything in the South, I assumed that every Southern person owned 50, 100, 250 slaves. They were all gone with the wind plantations, right? But I learned, obviously from studying it, that it's not the case at all. And if you read the notes, how many or what percentage of Southerners owned no slaves at all?
60 or 40, was it one of the two?
You're pretty close. 64% did not own a single slave. 64%. When you think of that, and then you think about the fact that we usually say that the Civil War was fought over slavery, if 64% of them don't even own slaves, why would they fight to be able to keep slaves? Why would they be willing to die to keep something that they don't even participate in themselves?
They're poor whites and they like superiority.
Well, that was a rhetorical question you weren't supposed to answer. So what percentage owned 1 to 5 slaves?
What percentage of actual slave owners or people in the South period?
People in the South period. I don't know if you're going to be able to see this even if I turn it on. Let's see what happens. Anyway, 18%. So now we're up to what's those two numbers added together?
72. 82.
82. So we're talking about 82% of all of the Southerners, and $18% of them only own 1 to 5 slaves. We're not talking these huge plantations. We're talking about a person who has 1 or 2 slaves that they work alongside with, that probably isn't a slave in the sense of it's the person who sleeps out in the shed and gets beaten every day. It's someone who becomes more like the family member because you have to work.
And stuff like that, and cook
What?
for 'em, take care of the children and cook for them, or live in the house.
Yeah. So, you know, when we're talking about this group, most of these slaves were probably treated pretty well. They were still slaves, but they were, you know, the owner depended on them more and really needed them to work with them and be cooperative with them. Then you get into the ones that owned 5 to 50 slaves. I've never understood why they do things like this and the colors are so close that you can't hardly see the difference. It doesn't make any sense to me. But anyway, 15.5% owned between 5 and 50. And only that 2.5% lived on those large plantations with 50 or more slaves. So when we think of those old movies like Gone with the Wind, it's a very small percentage of the southern population that has those types of plantations. Most of these people have relatively small farms and have relatively few number of slaves. So we've already talked about that. 1 to 5 is 18%, 5 to 50 is 15.5%, and 50 plus is 2.5%. So we talked about some of the economic factors such as the cotton gin and expansion. The cotton gin gave them the ability to have that kind of expansion. The major increase in cotton production because the demand kept rising and the South just kept planting more cotton to solve that. Keep in mind too that this isn't all going overseas. Where is the industrial production in the United States taking place as far as textiles?
North.
In the North, right? So the South, instead of kind of combining agriculture with industry and having their own factories and producing textiles themselves, were satisfied with sending it to the North and letting the northern factories do the producing. I mean, there were some factories, don't get me wrong, but not many compared to what they had in the North. The other thing, and let me show you should have left that on. Let me show you a couple things that'll give you a little bit better visual depiction of this. Maybe this thing will work. Well, let me show you this first, going back to population. You can tell that's blue and purple, right? In the different circles. And then do you see that there's some red as well? So the red are free blacks. So obviously there's not a tremendous amount of them. The 3% that's in Louisiana, you know, when we talk about Cajun, this is where a lot of it was the free black community in Louisiana that are now generally referred to as the area where the Cajun population was. Anyway, when we talked before about 8 million whites and 4 million blacks, you can kind of see in each state the makeup of the population and why they might have been concerned about the possibility of uprisings and revolts. Are there any states that have more slaves than they do whites?
South Carolina.
South Carolina? Mississippi? I think that might be the only two. But you can see all through here, it's pretty close to, 50-50. And when we talk about the internal slave trade, well, before I get to that, let me show you this. If you look at the top part of this map, which is supposed to show 1820, what they're showing you here are the areas of cotton production. The darker area, like here, is a real major production area, and then the other orange areas are they're production areas for cotton, but not as major as it was there in South Carolina. That's 1820, before the real kind of kickoff of shifting to short staple cotton. This is what things look like in 1860. So the real major production areas are in the middle of Georgia, Alabama, and then Mississippi, right? What began to happen is a lot of slaves started to be moved from the upper South, from the tobacco states, Maryland, Virginia, and places like that, into the lower South to be able to deal with the new cotton production. Now remember, after 1808, you could no longer buy slaves from outside the country, at least not legally. So you had to be, if you wanted more slaves, you either had to have babies or you had to be able to buy them from within the United States. So from somewhere between 600,000 and 900,000 slaves were bought and sold in this period of time, 1830 to 1860, most of them moving from upper South to lower South. And when we talk about them being purchased, they're being separated from their wives, kids, relatives that they have grown up with, and being taken into these places and moved to other areas. No one ever, or I shouldn't say they never did, but probably most of the time they didn't take into consideration that when they did this, that they were separating families. They didn't care. The slave was a commodity. So you hear a lot of those stories coming out of this time period because of what they dealt with. So if that's the southern cotton production, I don't know why they do this. Instead of giving you a map that matches the dates, because remember the last one was 1820 for cotton production, for some reason they decided to start with 1790. But these are the slaves. The slave population in 1790. And as you can see, obviously they're mostly on the coast, and this area would have been like rice production, and then the other heavy areas would have been mostly tobacco production. But this is 1860. And again, you can see that the darker areas are kind of across what they refer to as the cotton belt. So I don't particularly like this next map. I don't think it's extremely useful, but at least it gives you an idea. This is what they refer to as the internal slave trade and the different routes. And if you could pick up where the arrows are, you can see that they're kind of all coming down this direction, from up there down. Now some of it is coming up, but most of it is generating from the upper south down into this cotton belt. Another thing, I hate this thing. What do you think that's showing you?
Railroads.
Say that again?
Railroads.
The railroads. This is the distribution of railroad tracks in, well, they're saying 1850 to 1860. And remember what I said last week? Where's all the track?
No.
Pretty much in the north, right? And again, what you probably don't know, and you'll know more about this if you take American history too, is that when we get into the latter part of the 1800s, it's really the railroads that are what moves the economy forward. The big railroad tycoons that start putting railroads all over the country, without those railroads, the rest of the economy doesn't work. And that becomes sort of the engine for the economy in the late 1800s. And of course, the South, by the time you get to the Civil War, they have nothing. And it got worse because most of what they did have was destroyed during the war. So it's another reason why the North continues to be more successful in terms of economy after the Civil War, because the tycoons are not putting their railroads down here, they're putting them out west and more in the north. I don't generally spend a lot of time on this because I think we all have a pretty good idea that slaves were not exactly treated well. They didn't have, nice plush bedrooms and satin sheets and things like that. They usually were given 2 sets of clothing a year, enough food to survive, but not anything really special or expensive. And depending on where they were, sometimes they were treated relatively kindly, other times they were treated like, worse than a dog, just not even treated like a person at all. As far as I thought that was another thing. The types of slaves, what did most slaves do?
In the field working.
Yeah, the vast majority of them just worked out in the fields doing tobacco, rice, cotton. There were some slaves that were specially trained to have skills like carpentry, blacksmith, things like that, and they often were like rented out to other people to be able to bring in money. What would be the next probably major category of slave?
The family, taking care of babies.
The domestic ones, the ones that worked in the house, took care of the children, did the cooking, the cleaning. If you were a slave, which one would you rather be?
The family.
What?
And eat.
In the house.
In the house? Probably be easier work, right? So of the slaves that were interviewed, what did they say?
Outside,
Why?
they can run.
More freedom.
They didn't feel the pressure of always being watched and the master knowing everything they did. They didn't feel the isolation from people who were in the same situation they were. But who's mostly in the house? Men or women?
Woman.
Women. So what's the other thing women in the house are going to suffer?
Right.
Yeah. Tremendous sexual abuse. Almost every female slave that worked inside a home was considered to just be game for the master, his sons, possibly his friends. It was just expected. So that was another main reason why they didn't want to have to be in the house. Now, one of the good things about being in the house is that you heard stuff. You usually were privy to information that the slaves outside never heard because you just were around the family, and they got to where those of us that have had the experience of having small children and how you think that they don't understand what you're saying so that you can just talk openly in front of them, and they usually end up saying something somewhere to get you in trouble. Yeah. Yeah, my son was good at that. Some of the stuff I've had to explain in my life is interesting. But anyway, they had the same attitude about slaves. They just assumed the slaves were too stupid to understand what they were saying, so they would talk very freely in front of them. For slaves that were trying to escape or possibly, lead some kind of uprising, they counted very heavily on those house slaves to gather information and share it with them. So they liked having somebody in the house to be able to feed the information, especially, like I said, if they were trying to escape or something. Escape was not common. Let me say attempted escape was not common, but it did happen quite a bit. But when you talk about 4 million slaves, it was a relatively small percentage that ever had the guts to actually try to escape. Now, an awful lot of that is because if you were a white person and you were a slave and you tried to escape, what's your advantage?
You're white.
You blend in, right? I mean, you're white. You can probably fake it and nobody would know that you were a servant or something. It's a whole lot tougher as a black person to just be out someplace and people are like, what are you doing out? Where's your master? Where's your home? So it's a whole lot harder for them to be able to blend in and make their escape. Plus, they've probably never been more than a couple miles from their home, so they don't know the geography, they don't know which way to go, they don't know if there's anybody they can trust. So it's extremely difficult for them to do this.
They probably
And
don't know how to function in the real world either.
yeah, they wouldn't have any idea how to how to get food, anything else. Plus, keep in mind, if you are going to try to escape, you probably do have people that you have, whether it's your own family, like a wife and kids, or just people that you've become close to, and you're going to try to leave that with no guarantee that you're ever going to be successful. It would take desperation, I would say, and tremendous courage to actually follow through on trying to escape, because your chances are going to be very, very slim. So it doesn't happen that often, but obviously as more and more people develop the Underground Railroad, which we all heard about when we were kids. I don't know how many of us thought it was an actual railroad underground back then. Most of us probably
I
did.
was like, cool, we had subways.
But resistance was probably more common. And by resistance, I don't mean actually attacking white people and things like that, but the more subtle forms of resistance. Because you probably know you can't escape. You probably know if you're too overt in your resistance, you're going to get the crap beat out of you, right? So you would do the kinds of things, and again, those of us that have had kids, we know what they do. My son was an expert at playing stupid on how to do something, and then before I know it, I'm doing it for him, right? To teach him how to do it while he's sitting there watching me.
My kids still do that. My two oldest ones are 22 and 20, so.
Well, my son doesn't do it anymore, but he did it a lot when he was like
They don't
10,
unlearn
12,
it.
14. I don't know how many times I mowed the lawn while he watched me.
Oh, he was not playing.
Exactly.
No, he knew exactly what he was doing. But, so their resistance was often to try to pretend dumb, like they didn't understand how to do something. They would break tools and then claim that they didn't know that slamming the hoe across the tree was going to break it. I don't know why that happened, that kind of thing. So it's part of the reason, though, why I think whites developed a concept of blacks as being so stupid. Because they pretended to be stupid to get away with stuff, but whites fell for it and came to believe that blacks really didn't have the intelligence to take care of themselves. So it worked, but in some ways it backfired on them long term. Because, I think I'm the oldest person in this room, and, I grew up 60s and 70s when racism was still pretty prevalent in this country and we were still fighting for you know, a lot of, I mean, not that there isn't racism, there still is, I realize that, but it was much worse back then. And I definitely grew up not knowing where it came from exactly, because I don't really think my family was extremely racist, but it was just a common thought process that blacks just weren't as smart as we were. It just was assumed. And I don't think people necessarily meant that in a racist way, they just really believed that. And it has taken a long time, I think, for us to overcome that attitude. There were actually, though, some revolts. So there were some times that blacks tried to band together and revolt against whites. Most of the time they weren't at all successful. There's three famous ones. The first one was in 1800 by a guy named Gabriel Prosser. And he had gathered thousands of blacks that they had, you know, orchestrated a rebellion, and there was a certain time and place that they were going to initiate it. But a couple of the blacks within the group that was supposed to do this got nervous and decided that if they turned them in, it would help their cause, and they would probably be treated better by their masters or get some kind of reward or something. So they gave it up, and he and several of his leaders were executed for planning this. So nothing ever happened because it was found out before they were able to do it. That was in 1800.
But they killed the people that turned them in too.
Yeah,
The people that snitched.
yeah.
Told
They
them
didn't,
they were killed too.
right, they didn't calculate correctly. And then the second one was a guy named Denmark Vesey, or Vesey, not sure how it's pronounced, and I forget the date.
1822.
22? Thanks. Again, the conspiracy was found out before they could actually do something. How many, you have an answer, how many were killed there?
Says that 35 were hung
Yeah. So
and 37 sold down the river.
sold down the river was kind of like what I was talking about, you know, moving them down in the lower south away from their family, friends, anybody that they might have conspired with. So 35 people that were considered the true leaders of this were executed. The third one did happen, and this is the one that really kind of changed things in the South. Is that 1831?
Yeah.
You don't need to remember those dates, but this date is a little more important. Nat Turner gathered some blacks together, and they were able to get some weapons, and they just started attacking every house where white people lived in this particular county. And before they were captured and, you know, stopped, they had killed somewhere between 55 and 60 whites, and we're talking men, women, and children. They just,
Set the houses on fire.
and it's
so.
pretty brutal,
Yeah.
actually. But you can see the pent-up anger that they had. I mean, I'm not excusing what they did, but you can understand why once you get started, it would just kind of take over. So after Nat Turner, there was a reaction, and the South became much more concerned about this kind of thing happening and began to crack down more in terms of the various laws as far as restricting black movement throughout the South. One of the main things they did was really try to restrict any kind of literature coming into the South that might argue against slavery. So any abolitionist literature was banned. I mean, you just were not allowed to send it into the South or have it in the South. And then maybe even more importantly, they were able to get a law passed in Congress called the gag rule, which we all know what gag means, right? To gag somebody is to keep them from speaking, right? So do you see the date on that, Jennifer? 1830 something, isn't it?
To the white reaction.
Yeah, it should say the gag rule someplace and have a date. I don't know which page
You
it's
see
on.
1830s. Oh, the gag rule of 1836.
1836, okay, thanks. So they were able to get this passed in Congress where it was actually illegal for them to bring up any kind of bill or issue in Congress that had to do with the abolition of slavery. They just were not allowed to discuss it. I mean, it's kind of a major issue in our country at this time, and they just banned discussion of it in Congress. So you can see the South had some pretty strong influence at this point in time to keep this from even being able to be discussed in Congress. So this reaction by the South really kind of cracks down on anything that might lead more and more blacks to learn about freedom and things like that, and to even think about revolting. Oh, Prosser, B.C. Turner, I didn't realize I had that on there. All right, in your discussion board for today, like that cool little thing there? No clue, my daughter did. Some of the main arguments that they brought forth, and you guys would have already discussed this in your discussion board, was, I mean, if these are religious people and they consider themselves to be godly people, if the Bible doesn't condemn slavery, then why are you looking at us and judging us? You know, the Bible says it's fine. We're all godly people here. We're all Christians, right? So it should be fine. A second argument was, you know, we don't today talk about the greatness of Greece and Rome and how we try to aspire to be like them, but people did that back in this time period. Greece and Rome were definitely exalted as being these great civilizations, and their argument was these two great civilizations were built on the backs of slaves. So if we think they were so wonderful, then why are we criticizing them because they had slavery, or why are we criticizing ourselves? But this might be the most important thing. I don't know how, and I don't need to know, this is a rhetorical question here. I don't know how you feel about marijuana and whether or not you think it should be legal in this country. Because of my own personal experiences, and not in my life, because I really, literally have never smoked pot and have never really had any desire to do so, but my brother was an alcoholic and a drug user and died at the age of 55. My son is only 23 and he has been smoking pot, I think, since he was 14, and I think that's a lot to do with why he can't seem to get his life together, because he would rather smoke pot than go have a job.
Mission easy.
So I personally have issues with it. I understand an awful lot of people do it and function normally and have jobs and do everything else that they're supposed to do, but my own personal opinion is that even if it were legal, I still wouldn't try it, and I still probably really wouldn't want to be around it. But again, that's because my experiences with people in my life that are important to me have not been positive. However, if it becomes legal, I'm not going to judge people because they choose to do it. I may decide not to spend a lot of time with them or hang out with them while they're smoking pot, but I mean, what can I say? It's legal. How can I judge them if they're doing something that the law of our land allows them to do? So these people were saying the same thing. The Constitution does not forbid me from having slaves. So who are you to tell me that what I'm doing is wrong? I am not doing anything illegal. So leave me alone. You know, that was their argument. And another important argument that I think makes more sense than we realize is that they argued that the slave system was paternalistic and benevolent. It's kind of hard to argue when those are big words and you may not even know what they mean, right? I mean, what does this mean? What is paternalistic?
Like father to them, so they're taking good care of them.
Yeah, and they need a good father, right? Some of us have not had good fathers, so we may not think that's so cool. But they're talking about a father who takes care of his family, supports them, protects them. So their argument was, we're like their parents. We take care of them. We provide them a place to live. We feed them. We make sure that they're safe. At least from everybody but us, right? And benevolent, the same kind of thing. To be benevolent means you want good things for somebody. You want to help them have a good life. Now, we might say today, how could they even say that? But what are they comparing it to?
To know the way that people who work in the north side.
People who worked in factories in the north at this time, their lives were horrible. They made nothing. They lived in shacks. They worked 60 hours a week and could barely survive. If they got injured, they're just fired. There's no unemployment. There's no disability. There's nothing. At least here, if you get old as a slave, you still get to live on the plantation. They still feed you. They still give you a bed to sleep in. I mean, a bed meaning straw on the floor in the shack, but still. So their argument was, we treat our slaves better than you treat your factory workers. So who are you to judge us? So, I mean, you got to admit, they actually have some pretty good arguments. Not everybody agreed with them. So you begin to have abolitionists that begin to speak out against slavery. One of those groups, one of the very first groups, was the American Colonization Society, which I think formed in 1817. And they didn't necessarily want blacks here, but they wanted them to be free. So they tried to form colonies for them to go to so that they could be free. So Haiti was one of those places, and then Liberia in Africa was a colony that was established to try to move blacks to so that they could have their own freedom. The Lane Rebels are mainly a group of ministers that spoke out very strongly against slavery, wrote lots and lots of stuff, traveled the country, gave speeches, just really tried to get people to see the evils of slavery so that they would understand that this benevolent system was not so benevolent after all. William Lloyd Garrison, I think I might have mentioned him before, short little nerdy looking white guy that was just as courageous as anybody has ever been in life. Just for 30 years, no compromise. It's wrong, it needs to be abolished immediately, we have no right to treat these people this way. Was almost killed on several occasions and just kept right on speaking out. Amazing little dude. Frederick Douglass, an ex-slave that obviously spoke out, had to be a little more careful than William Lloyd Garrison because he wasn't white. Obviously, he had to have a little bit more discernment in terms of how he went about things, but probably the strongest black leader against slavery. And then Harriet Beecher Stowe, who was she?
And I had 300 people to be free from the railroad. Is that not this one?
She wrote-
That's Harriet
I read-
Tubman.
She was a writer, she wrote Uncle Tom's Cabin.
Uncle
right?
Tom's Cabin. Her book, because of the way that it told the story about a black family being separated and some being sold off because of the internal slave trade, and the way that she depicted the whole slave system, really got to the heart of kind of the middle class America and made them realize that this system that probably many of them really didn't know that much about, those in the North, how horrible it really was. And I mentioned, right, that what Lincoln said to her when he met her.
Yeah, is that you, that lady that bring up the wall?
Yeah, basically blamed the Civil War on her, that because of her, you know, it made people want to fight and get
This
angry.
is a test of the EFSC emergency phone system. This is only a test. EFSC will conduct a test during each semester of the emergency phone system. If this had been an actual emergency, appropriate directions would have followed. Thank you and have a great day. This concludes the test of the EFSC emergency system.
That was God. He's on my side, remember? So anyway, that is Harriet Beecher Stowe, and this is her picture. And that's the end of my PowerPoint. And you guys are thinking, you got the job on that PowerPoint? Let me just check my notes and see if there was anything else I wanted to mention. Oh, just to keep in mind that, you know, we tend to think of the North as being against slavery and the South being for it, and that's really not true. The North, for the most part, was pretty ambivalent. Most Northerners were just kind of like, it's not here, I don't have to deal with it, you know, I don't really want blacks living next door to me anyway. They weren't that concerned, and that's why Harriet Beecher Stowe's book was so important, because many of those people who'd been on the fence, it kind of turned them and made them realize that maybe they should have an opinion on this subject. But there are lots of racists in the North who, when the abolitionists started to come out and really start speaking out strongly against slavery, they were against the abolitionists. So it's not just South versus North. I mean, even the abolitionists in the North are dealing with a lot of flack from people living around them. So,
A lot of those rich businessmen were making a lot of their money from the cotton from the South.
Right.
And the slave people. If slavery ended, they were gonna lose a lot of money.
right,
Yeah, they'd have to pay more for the cotton stuff, but
absolutely.
slaves had to get paid, so.
But it's just, it's easy to be simplistic about, you know, the concept when you get to the Civil War that all of the North is against slavery and all the South is for it. It just isn't like that. I mean, there's lots of diaries of Northern soldiers that talk about how they're not fighting this war, and they use the N-word. I mean, not, it's very hard for me to even say that, even if I'm just quoting something, but they just are like, I'm not fighting for those niggers. I'm not, you know, this isn't why I'm here. I'm doing it for this reason. I'm doing it, you know. So in their mind, if they had been told that they were fighting for the blacks, fighting to free the blacks, they wouldn't have been there. Because in their mind, that was not what this was all about. So, you know, you have an awful lot of people in the North that are just as racist as the Southerners. You know, it's just, you can't categorize it as the North is, you know, morally opposed to slavery. That really wasn't the issue. One other thing that's in your notes that I didn't spend time on at all was talking about the ones who do have the 50 or more slaves, you know, what they refer to as the planters, you know, the aristocracy of the South, and how much power and control they have. But their wives are very isolated. They pretty much just live on the plantation. And remember, the wife is in the house with the black female slaves that their husbands are having sex with, you know. So it's a very difficult situation for the white female that's the mistress of the house. So you can see where she may not necessarily treat the black slaves in her home very well, because she's jealous and frustrated that this is all going on. So that's another issue. So there's a little bit in the notes that talk about that, which you can read on your own. But most of the rest of it, I think we covered. Let me just show you one other thing. I'm from Ohio, and we don't grow cotton in Ohio. So I had never seen cotton growing until I was in the South, and I was actually on my way to Andersonville. Have you guys heard of Andersonville? In the past, I've used it as an assignment in this class, and we're not doing it this semester, but we'll talk about it a little bit toward the end. But Andersonville is probably the most infamous Civil War prison where Union soldiers were held by the South. And it's just outside of, I think, Macon, Georgia. I forget exactly. But if you're going up I-75, you get off somewhere near Macon and you go several miles to the west, and you get to Andersonville. But I was on my way there to visit that place because it's actually a national park and a museum for prisoners of war. So it's not just for the Civil War, but it's actually a museum for all prisoners of war that we've had throughout history. So it's a pretty cool place to visit if you get a chance. So anyway, we're on our way there, and I wasn't driving. And all of a sudden I start screaming, "Stop, stop, stop!" Of course, you never do that in a car. It can completely kill you. But I was doing it because I was seeing this. Not that. Not that. Drum roll. I know it's not a very good picture, but what is that?
Cotton.
That's cotton. I was like so excited. I've never seen cotton just growing in a field. So I jump out of the car and I go running over there. And look how happy I am. And then I proceeded, the ethical person that I am, to steal the cotton. I don't know if you can tell that that's my hand getting in there. I snapped off a little piece. I actually have it in my office. A lot of times I bring it. I forgot to bring it to class. And then we saw a great big cotton where it was in the already baled up. I don't know quite how they do that. It's some big kind of machine that and then they load it up on a truck to take it where they're going. But that whole thing is just
Square.
one big, huge bale of cotton.
Big football.
And nobody came out with a huge bail, like pointing at your face?
No, I was kind of like waiting to get shot or something, but
Like in Hawaii when you step on the pineapple field?
really?
Guns are like right at you.
Well, thank God they didn't, because I don't know, I think they would have let me go, because I was so happy. I was just so excited. They would have been like, okay, you're just too weird to
Just go home.
take the damn cotton and get in your car and go home. Anyway, but, yeah, that was my one and only PowerPoint. At least it was a little different than anything else we've done in here before. So you had a quiz, right, that was supposed to be due today? Yes? And a discussion board.
Yes.
Looked like most of you did the discussion board. That was on what we just talked about, the pro-slavery argument. But the quiz will be open until midnight. Amber mentioned that she had trouble with Angel. Is anybody having issues? Because, you know, they did the update over the weekend, and I had trouble. I couldn't get into Angel for a day or so.
I've always had trouble with Angels since only this semester though. Like
Right.
I can't send messages all the time. I can't always send messages. Sometimes I can't post like my discussions.
Like, it randomly log me out sometimes.
Yeah,
Not
logs
even
you.
for a long period of time, maybe for a couple minutes, it'll just boot me out.
Well, it's funny, because supposedly this update was going to fix some of those things, and I'm having more trouble after the update than I was before
This
the update.
semester only though, I've never had an issue.
Well, you know, we're switching to a different system, but it's not going to be, I think it'll be next fall before you'll see it in all of your classes. Now, you may end up taking a class that is going to be doing the pilot. So there's going to be a group of instructors that are going to be using the new system in the spring. But right now, it's between Blackboard, which owns Angel, but they're trying to get people off of Angel because they don't want to support Angel any longer. So they're really trying to get people to switch from Angel to Blackboard. It's actually called Blackboard Learn, because I think Blackboard has several different ones now.
I had to do a Florida Virtual School, and that's the program that they use.
Learn? Really?
That's what I use on my tablet to access Angel, is Learn. You can go in through Learn and it'll get you into Angel.
Oh, yeah, because they do own it. That makes,
But it is terrible. There's no calendar. There's no calendar option. You can't even click on a calendar. It's not like it's there, you can't go to it, it's not there at all. And every time I log out of it, if I try to go back into it, it will not let me. I have to go into my app settings and erase all history and all data, and then go back in and re-log in and re-accept everything every single time. I have no idea why it does that, but I mean, once you get in, as long as you're not trying to use your calendar, it's okay. You can access the notes and stuff, and you can do whatever you want, but it's.
well, the other one that we're considering, because they looked at like 4 different ones and then they narrowed it down to 2. And the other one that we're considering is called Canvas. And the woman who's kind of in charge of getting the word out to faculty so that they can, we have shells that we can experiment with and play with in both of them. Her personal favorite, and she's told me this because we work closely together, is Canvas. But, you know, it's up to the faculty to make their decision, and they have to get in there and look at both of them and decide. I've looked at both of them a little bit, but not as extensively as I should to make that kind of decision. We're supposed to fill out a survey by November 25th, giving our opinion. And then they'll announce which one we're going to go with sometime in December. But anyway, my point is you guys may be in a class next semester that could be using the new system because they're going to try to pilot it and find out what kind of issues and glitches might be with it before we roll it out to everybody next fall. But it's always a huge hassle when you switch learning management systems. Yeah, so I don't know what's going to, hopefully the issues with Angel right now are just minor things that will get worked out in the next week or so since they've done these updates, but I was a little bit panicked when I couldn't even get into Angel at all. It wasn't like I couldn't just do a couple things, it just kept saying that the system was unavailable and you can't get in. It was like, oh great, it was supposed to be back up and running on Sunday and I couldn't get in at all. So anyway, if you have issues getting in, was my point, with the quiz, please email me and tell me that, you know, you're having problems, and if we have to, I'll extend the quiz time if we have issues with people not being able to open it. That was Karen Ott, she just put a note on the door, 7:14. We're supposed to have dinner together after class. All right, well, make sure you take the quiz, do the discussion board if you haven't already. I have a couple papers to return. Where's Rachel? Well, she dropped, but she had called me the week before, not called me, she had emailed me the week before she dropped and said that her grandmother had become suddenly ill and she and her mom were on their way to take care of her or find out what was wrong with her. And it was, I think the week before the midterm or the week of the midterm. And then she wrote to me and said, you know, I don't know how long we're going to be gone. Will I be able to make everything up when I get back? And I said, yeah, I'll work with you. You know, I realized she's probably the kind of person that if her mom had believed she was be home by herself, you know. So then the next thing I got was a notice that she had withdrawn without her actually communicating again with me. So she must have felt like she got too far behind or get caught up in it. So. All right, have a good night.
Because I've never done one, so, you know, it'd just be interesting to know for me. Because you weren't well off.
Oh, only that you don't have numbers in the bibliography.
Oh,
You just,
okay.
everything else is correct, you just don't have numbers.
Well, I thought they were just wrong.
And then numbers, you just, you know.
Oh, yeah, I did real good with the spelling.
But that, yeah, that's all. I just marked them off because you don't need numbers in the bibliography.
All right, that was funny, because I was like, okay, I thought I did it right, but okay.
No, it was a good paper.
Thank you. That way I'll know for next time, to put numbers on it.
All right.